In 2008, around 70,400,000 women voted in the presidential election. In this election, women outnumber men by almost 10 million, which follows a steady trend that started in the 1980s. But this statistic may have never occurred if it weren't for the 19th Amendment. The 19th Amendment, which was ratified in 1920, states, "The rights of the citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on the account of sex," which means that all women in the United States could finally vote after almost 150 years of disenfranchisement. Many women and men throughout American history have fought in the crusade for women's suffrage. In our country's infancy, Abigail Adams wrote several letters to her husband, John Adams, on the issue of women's rights. Abigail wrote John in 1776, "I long to hear that you have declared an independency, and by the way, in the new code of laws which I suppose will be necessary for you to make, I desire that you remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors." But reformed women's rights were not considered due to the belief that women were either not competent enough to vote, or that politics would be a bad influence. Also, many men saw women's rights and women's suffrage as a threat to their masculinity. Few took up the fight for women's suffrage in the next few decades, but the fight started to heat up in 1848 when Gerrit Smith was nominated as the presidential candidate for the Liberty Party. At the National Liberty Party Convention in Buffalo, New York, his party adopted the platform of universal suffrage in its broadest sense, that females as well as males should be entitled to vote. Gerrit Smith had been inspired to fight for women's suffrage after years of debating politics with his cousin, Elisabeth Cady Stanton. 1848 was a busy year for Elisabeth Cady Stanton. A month after her cousin was nominated as a presidential candidate, Elisabeth, along with Lucretia Mott and Mary Ann McClintock, hosted the Seneca Falls Convention in upstate New York to discuss women's rights. At the convention, Elisabeth Cady Stanton read her Declaration of Sentiments, which listed grievances that women had about their position in society. Stanton started off the declaration with the radical statement, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." Many agreed with the grievances Stanton listed, but the convention went into an uproar when Stanton proposed a resolution that it is the duty of women of this country to secure themselves to the sacred right of the elected franchise. Many, including Lucretia Mott, wanted the resolution of women's suffrage removed, but Stanton defended women's suffrage, saying that women would then be able to influence future legislation and gain further rights. Finally, a former slave stood up in defense of Stanton and women's suffrage, saying, "This denial of the right to participate in government is not merely the degradation of women and the perpetuation of a great injustice, but the maiming and repudiation of one half of the moral and intellectual power of the government of the world." The former slave's name was Frederick Douglass, and his words persuaded the others in attendance to pass the resolution and help create a new goal for women's rights. When the Seneca Falls Convention ended, the attendees resolved to meet again to discuss women's rights, which they did every year from 1850 until the outbreak of the Civil War. The meetings were called the National Women's Rights Convention, and it was held in several cities around the country, and issues such as abolition, education, women's wages, career opportunities, women's property rights, marriage reform, temperance, and most of all, women's suffrage were discussed. Lucy Stone, one of the organizers of the convention, encouraged both men and women to lobby their local, state, and nation lawmakers, and she outlined what the goal of women's rights should be by saying, "We want to be something more than the appendages of society. We want that women should be the co-equal and help meet men in all interests and perils and enjoyments of human life. We want that she should attain the development of her nature and her womanhood. We want that when she dies, it may not be written on her gravestone that she was the relic of somebody." In 1851, on a street in Seneca Falls, Elisabeth Cady Stanton was introduced to Susan Brownell Anthony. Susan was originally part of the emerging temperance movement, but she had been ostracized by other women due to her radical ideas about women's rights. After the meeting, they decided to combine their efforts and focus solely on women's rights, especially on women's suffrage. The next few years, there were several victories for women's rights. Several states passed reformed marriage laws and reformed property laws. During the Civil War, many women's rights advocates took a hiatus from the movement to focus on the war effort, But after the war ended, Anthony and Stanton began publishing The Revolution, a weekly women's rights newspaper that heavily criticized the Republican Party for not granting women the right to vote along with African American men. Stanton and Anthony also formed the National Women's Suffrage Association, an organization of mostly women whose goal was the ratification of a constitutional amendment that would give women the right to vote. At the same time, Lucy Stone founded the American Women's Suffrage Association, which focused on women's suffrage and women's rights issues on a state level. The two groups disagreed on many issues, but in 1890 they merged into one, calling themselves the National American Women's Suffrage Association. After the death of Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the National American Women's Suffrage Association decided to focus on lobbying individual states for suffrage. Many disagreed with this tactic and felt that Anthony and Stanton's original vision of a constitutional amendment should be pursued. Two women who felt this way were Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, and the two women left the group to form the National Women's Party in 1917. The NWP and their tactics were considered extremely radical, especially since the country was embroiled in war in Europe. The NWP picketed outside the White House for months asking, "Mr. President, how long must women wait for liberty?" Members of the NWP, including Alice Paul and Lucy Burns, were arrested and charged with obstructing traffic and later imprisoned. In prison, the NWP went on a hunger strike and were force-fed by prison staff. The nation was scandalized when accounts of the force feedings became public, and President Wilson worried about America's reputation abroad. In January 1918, the president made a speech in front of Congress asking for the passage of women's suffrage. He called it a war measure by saying, "We have made partners of women in this war. Shall we admit them only to a partnership of suffering and sacrifice and toil, and not a partnership of right?" After several attempts, the 19th Amendment gained the two-thirds majority needed for ratification. Finally, in November of 1920, after generations of disenfranchisement, women could finally express their opinions at the voting booth and be full participants in the American democracy.